Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. We are back playing high-powered Commander. We will be using the newest commanders from the Wilds of Eldraine set. We took the commanders, cranked them to 11, and now we will see how they do tonight. A big thanks to Wizards of the Coast for sponsoring today's video. Check out the link in the description below for more Wilds of Eldraine. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Ryan piloting Kellan the fae-blooded. This deck seeks to get multiple equipment onto the battlefield, one-shot its opponents, or go wide and swing with a buffed army. Ryan's opening hand contains an Archivist of Ogma, Swords to Plowshares, Stoneforge Mystic, Colossus Hammer, Scalding Tarn, Ancient Tomb, and his London Mulligan is a Tybalt Trickery. Next, we have Drake piloting Korvold Gleeful Glutton. This deck seeks to put its library into its graveyard and assemble multiple graveyard-based combos. Drake's opening hand contains a Mana Vault, Unmarked Grave, Carrion Feeder, Postmortem Lunge, Moldervine Cloak, Turn the Earth, and a City of Brass. After that, we have Zeb piloting Yenna Red Tooth Regent. This deck seeks to cast multiple enchantments, copy them with the commander, then assemble one of many 2-card combos. Zeb's opening hand contains a Utopia Sprawl, Soul Ring, Rest in Peace, Smuggler's Share, Jeweled Lotus, Survival of the Fittest, and a Windswept Heath. Finally, we have Alana piloting Rowan Scion of War. This deck seeks to pay a ton of life and use its commander's ability to discount massive game-ending spells. Alana's opening hand contains a Badlands, Sulphurous Springs, Hall of the Bandit Lord, Plunge into Darkness, Ragavan Nimble Pilfer, and her London Mulligans are Wheel of Fortune and Talisman of Indulgence. Without further ado, let's kick off this enchanting, egregious, energizing envoy. Ryan spilled the most coffee on his lap, so he gets to start us off. Ryan draws a card for turn and plays a Scalding Tarn. He passes. Drake draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Vault. Drake passes. Zeb draws and plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Yenna Red Tooth Regent. With nothing else, Zeb ends his turn. Alana draws and plays a Badlands. She casts Ragavan Nimble Pilfer. Alana passes. At the end of Alana's turn, Ryan cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Sacred Foundry onto the battlefield tapped. Ryan draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Stoneforge Mystic. It enters, and Ryan fetches up a Cauldron Complete into his hand. All through, Ryan passes. Drake draws and plays a City of Brass. He taps it to help cast Culling Ritual. It resolves, wiping most of the board, and Drake adds 2 black and 2 green. Next, Drake casts Unmarked Grave, fetching up a Hermit Druid into his graveyard. He pays 2 life to help cast Postmortem Lunge, returning Hermit Druid to the battlefield, giving it haste until the end of turn. He activates Hermit Druid. Since there are no basic lands in his deck, he mills his entire library. He sacrifices Hermit Druid to flashback Cabal Therapy, targeting Zeb. Bridge from Below triggers, and Drake creates a zombie. Poxwalker triggers, and Drake returns it from the graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Drake considers what he should name with Therapy, knowing that there are only a few cards that could possibly beat his deck. He thinks on it for a bit and decides to name the only possible silver bullet against him, Rest in Peace. Zeb reveals his hand, which actually contains a Rest in Peace, and Zeb has to discard it. The table goes insane, and Zeb could not believe Drake's luck. With nothing else, Drake passes to a very upset Zeb. Zeb draws and plays a Forest. He casts Utopia Sprawl, naming white as it enters. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Smuggler's Share. Zeb ships the turn. Alana draws and plays a Sulphurous Springs. She casts Dark Confidant. She passes. Ryan draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Birthright Boon. He fetches up a Hammer of Nazan into his hand, and then Kellan goes on an adventure. He casts Archivist of Ogma and passes to Drake. During his upkeep, Drake casts Turn the Earth, shuffling Reanimate, Veil of Summer, and a Boseiju Who Endures into his library and gaining 2 life. He draws and delves away some of his graveyard and convokes 2 creatures to cast Hogak from his graveyard. He sacrifices 3 creatures to flash back Dread Return. Poxwalker triggers and Drake returns it to the battlefield tapped. Bridge from Below triggers and Drake creates 2 zombies. Then Dread Return resolves and Drake returns Rot Hulk from his graveyard to the battlefield. Rot Hulk enters and Drake returns Phyrexian Delver, Mikaeus the Unhallowed, and Entugo Husk to the battlefield. Phyrexian Delver triggers and Drake returns Sylvan Safekeeper to the battlefield and loses 1 life. Drake activates Nantuko Husk, sacrificing Rot Hulk. Mikaeus triggers, returning Rot Hulk to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. Rot Hulk triggers, and Drake returns Putrid Imp, Deathbringer Thoktar, and Gravecrawler to the battlefield. Drake activates Nantuko Husk, sacrificing Deathbringer Thoktar. Mikaeus triggers, returning Thoktar to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. He activates Thoktar, removing a counter, pinging Alana for 1. Drake presents a loop of sacrificing Thoktar, bringing it back with a counter through Mikaeus, and removing a counter to ping an opponent. He does this over and over, until the table is dead, and Drake wins the game. In this game, Drake's opening hand contains a Moldervine Cloak, Imperial Seal, Light from the Loam, Veil of Summer, Altar of Dementia, Polluted Delta, and a Lion's Eye Diamond. Zeb's opening hand contains an Earthcraft, Gemstone Caverns, Veil of Summer, Forbidden Orchard, Eladamri's Call, Arcane Signet, and an Avacyn's Pilgrim. Alana's opening hand contains a Rakdos Signet, Wishclaw Talisman, Grim Monolith, Marsh Flats, Scalding Tarn, and her London Mulligans are Snuff-Out and Sulphurous Springs. Ryan's opening hand contains an Urza Saga, Conqueror's Flail, Skull Clamp, Arden Intrepid Archaeologist, Generous Gift, Mountain, and a Plains. And Drake gets to start us off. But Zeb has a pre-game action, putting Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Veil of Summer. Drake draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He casts an Imperial Seal, fetching up a card onto the top of his library and losing 2 life. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond and passes the turn. Zeb draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard. He taps it, giving Alana a Spirit to cast Arcane Signet. He casts Avacyn's Pilgrim. He passes. Alana draws and plays a Marsh Flats. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. She ends her turn. Ryan draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He casts a Skull Clamp. Ryan ships the turn. Drake draws and casts a Jeweled Lotus. He cracks Jeweled Lotus and Lion's Eye Diamond, discarding his hand to help cast its commander, Korvold, Gleeful Glutton. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Korvold. Zeb takes it, Korvold triggers, Drake puts 3+1/+1 counters onto Korvold, draws 2 cards, then dredges 3 to return life from the loam to his hand. In his second main phase, Drake plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He casts Life from the Loam, returning Arid Mesa, Nurturing Peatland, and Polluted Delta to his hand. All through, Drake ships the turn. Zeb draws and plays a Plains. He taps Forbidden Orchard, giving Alana a Spirit to help cast Smothering Tithe. Zeb ends his turn. Alana draws, Tithe triggers, and Zeb creates a treasure. She plays a Scalding Tarn for turn. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Swamp onto the battlefield. She casts Diabolic Intent, sacrificing a Spirit as an additional cost, fetching up a card into her hand. She casts a Mana Crypt. She casts a Grim Monolith. She casts Rakdos Signet. She casts a Wishclaw Talisman. After an explosive turnover, Alana passes. Ryan draws, Tithe triggers, and Zeb creates a treasure. In his main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Plains for turn. He casts Conqueror's Flail. He ends his turn. During his draw step, Drake dredges life from the loam back to his hand. He plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts life from the loam, returning Boseiju Who Endures to his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Alana with Korvold. Alana takes it, Korvold triggers, and in response, Drake channels Boseiju, targeting Smothering Tithe. Tithe is destroyed, and Zeb fetches up a Temple Garden onto the battlefield tapped. Then Korvold's ability resolves, Drake adds 4+1/+1 counters, then dredges life from the loam back to his hand and draws 3 cards. In his second main phase, Drake casts a Lotus Petal. He passes. At the end of Drake's turn, Zeb casts Eladamri's Call, fetching up a Ranger Captain of Eos into his hand. Zeb draws and casts Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters and Zeb fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He casts Esper Sentinel. He taps Forbidden Orchard, giving Alana another Spirit to cast Song of Freyalise, getting its first counter. Zeb ends his turn. During her upkeep, Alana loses her Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. She draws and casts her commander, Rowan, Scion of War. She gives the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets his final counter. He floats mana and sacrifices it, fetching up a Soul Ring onto the battlefield. He plays a Flooded Strand for turn. He casts Generous Gift, targeting Korvold. Esper Sentinel triggers, and Zeb draws. Korvold is destroyed, and Drake creates a 3/3 Elephant. Ryan cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts Birthright Boon. He fetches up a Sunforger into his hand, and Kellan goes on an adventure. Ryan gives the turn to Drake. During Drake's upkeep, Zeb sacrifices his Ranger Captain of Eos, locking out opponents from non-creature spells this turn. Drake draws and plays a Nurturing Peatland. He casts Insolent Neonate. He moves to combat and attacks Alana with his Elephant. Alana blocks with a Spirit, and Drake passes to Zeb. Zeb draws, and in his first main phase, Song of Freyalise gets another counter. He casts Squirrel Nest. He casts Earthcraft. All set to win, Zeb passes. At the end of Zeb's turn, Alana casts Tainted Pact. She exiles the top 2 before hitting Crackle with Power, putting it into her hand. The table knows what's coming, and Alana moves to her turn. During her upkeep, Alana loses her Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. During her draw step, Drake sacrifices Insolent Neonate, discards a card, and draws a card, looking for an answer. Still in her draw step, Drake sacrifices Nurturing Peatland, drawing a card. He does not find an answer, and Alana moves to her main phase. She activates Wishclaw Talisman, fetching up a card into her hand and giving Wishclaw to Ryan. She casts Plunge into Darkness. Esper Sentinel triggers, and Zeb draws. Plunge resolves, Alana pays 21 life, looks at the top 21 cards of her library, puts 1 into her hand, and exiles the rest. She activates Rowan, reducing her spells by 24 this turn. She casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Alana creates 10 treasures. She casts Crackle with Power, where X equals 8, targeting each opponent. Each opponent takes 40, dies, and Alana wins the game. In this game, Alana's opening hand contains a Treasonous Ogre, Demonic Tutor, Fire Covenant, Plunge into Darkness, Dark Ritual, Dockside Extortionist, and a Command Tower. Ryan's opening hand contains a Path to Exile, Ranger Captain of Eos, Enlightened Tutor, Felwar Stone, Urza Saga, Bloodstained Mire, and a City of Brass. Drake's opening hand contains an Undergrowth Stadium, Blood Crypt, Badlands, Chrome Mox, Dread Return, Imperial Seal, and a Golgari Thug. Zeb's opening hand contains a Giver of Runes, Soul Ring, Wooded Foothills, Earthcraft, Temple Garden, Kenrith's Transformation, and a Sanctum Prelate. And Alana gets to start us off. Alana draws, plays a Command Tower, and passes. Ryan draws, plays a Bloodstained Mire, and also passes. Drake draws and plays an Undergrowth Stadium. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Drake ends his turn. Zeb draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. Zeb ships the turn. Alana draws and casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. She casts a Felwar Stone. She casts Demonic Tutor. She fetches up a card into her hand. She plays Hall of the Bandit Lord onto the battlefield tapped. Alana sends the turn to Ryan. At the end of Alana's turn, Ryan cracks his Bloodstained Mire, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. He casts Enlightened Tutor, fetching up a Mana Crypt onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Felwar Stone. He casts Birthright Boon, fetching up a Hammer of Nazan into his hand, and Kellan goes on adventure. With nothing else, Ryan ends his turn. Drake draws and plays a Badlands. He casts a Hermit Druid. The table stands to attention, and Drake passes the turn. Zeb draws and plays a Temple Garden into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Kenrith's Transformation, targeting Hermit Druid. Transformation enters, and Zeb draws a card. He casts Giver of Runes and passes to Alana. Alana draws and casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and Alana creates 5 treasures. She casts Cabal Ritual, adding 3 black. She casts Treasonous Ogre. The table knows it's game over, and Ogre resolves. She taps Hall of the Bandit Lord, paying 3 life to cast her commander, Rowan, Scion of War. She holds priority and casts Plunge into Darkness. Plunge resolves, Alana pays 27 life, and looks at the top 27 cards of her library. In the top 27, she does not find a payoff spell. So she puts a card into her hand and then exiles the rest. Then Rowan resolves and enters with haste. Unfortunately, Alana has to pass the turn. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws, and in his main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Mishra's Workshop for turn. He casts his commander, Kellan the fae-blooded. He casts Hammer of Nazan. It enters and attaches to Kellan. Ryan passes to Drake. Drake draws and plays a Blood Crypt into play tapped. He passes. Zeb draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts his commander, Yenna, Red Tooth Regent. He ships the turn. Alana draws and casts Blood Celebrant. She moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Rowan. Ryan takes it, and Alana ends her turn. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws, and in his main phase, Urza Saga triggers. In response, Ryan activates Urza Saga, creating a construct. He then sacrifices Urza Saga, fetching up a Colossus Hammer onto the battlefield. Hammer of Nazan triggers and attaches to Kellan. He plays a City of Brass for turn. He moves to combat and attacks Alana with Kellan. She chump blocks with Blood Celebrant, and Ryan passes the turn. Drake draws and casts Sylvan Safekeeper. He passes. Zeb draws and activates Yenna, creating a copy of Kenrith's Transformation. Yenna untaps and Zeb scries 2. Then Transformation enters, attaches to Kellan, and Zeb draws a card. He plays a Yavimaya, Cradle of Growth for turn. He casts Savine's Reclamation, returning Wooded Foothills to the battlefield. All through, Zeb passes. Alana draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. She casts Phyrexian Processor. It enters, and Alana pays 2 life. She ends her turn. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He casts Ranger Captain of Eos. It enters, and he fetches up a Mother of Runes into his hand. He taps his City of Brass to help cast Mother of Runes. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with a Construct and Alana with Kellan. Drake blocks with Hermit Druid, and Alana blocks with Treasonous Ogre. Both die, and Ryan passes the turn. Drake draws and casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts Dread Return, returning Hermit Druid to the battlefield. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Golgari Thug. Drake ships the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws and activates Yenna, creating a copy of Kenrith's Transformation. Yenna untaps and Zeb scries 2. Then Transformation enters, attached to Ryan's Mother of Runes, and Zeb draws. He plays a Gemstone Caverns for turn. He casts Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Yenna as an additional cost. He fetches up a Ranger Captain of Eos onto the battlefield. Ranger Captain enters, and Zeb fetches up a Walking Ballista into his hand. He casts Walking Ballista where X equals 1. Zeb passes to Alana. Alana draws and casts the One Ring. It enters, and she gains protection from everything. She moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Rowan. Ryan takes it, and Alana passes the turn. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Mountain. He taps the City of Brass to help cast Aurelia, the War Leader. He moves to combat and attacks Drake with Aurelia and Mother of Runes, and Zeb with Kellan and the Construct. Aurelia triggers, and Ryan attacks his creatures, getting in extra combat. Drake declares no blocks, and Zeb blocks Kellan with Ranger Captain. In response, Zeb activates Giver of Runes, targeting his Ranger Captain. In response, Ryan taps Mana Confluence to help cast Path to Exile, targeting Ranger Captain. In response, Zeb sacks Ranger Captain, locking out opponents from non-creature spells this turn. Then they both take it, and Ryan moves to his additional combat. He makes the same attacks at Drake and Zeb. They both take it all, and Ryan passes the turn. Drake draws and activates Hermit Druid. In response, Ryan sacrifices Ranger Captain, locking out opponents from non-creature spells this turn. Then Druid's ability resolves and Drake mills his entire library. Next, Drake delves away some of his graveyard and convokes to help cast Hogak, Arisen Necropolis, from his graveyard. Poxwalker's triggers and returns to the battlefield tapped. He casts Gravecrawler from his graveyard. Vengevine triggers and Drake returns it to the battlefield. With nothing else, Drake passes to Zeb. Zeb draws and casts Heliod, Sun Crown. He activates Heliod's ability, targeting Giver of Runes. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Giver. Ryan blocks with Aurelia. Giver of Runes dies and Zeb gains a life. Bridge from Below triggers and Drake exiles it from his graveyard. Heliod triggers and Zeb puts a counter onto Walking Ballista. Zeb activates Heliod, giving Walking Ballista lifelink until the end of turn. He removes a counter from Ballista, pinging Ryan for 1. Lifelink triggers, Zeb gains 1, Heliod triggers, and Zeb puts a counter onto Ballista. Zeb presents a loop of removing a counter, pinging an opponent, gaining a life, and putting a counter onto Ballista. He repeats this process until Ryan and Drake are dead. Since Alana has protection from everything, Zeb passes the turn. During Alana's upkeep, Zeb activates Walking Ballista, removing a counter, targeting Alana. In response, Alana activates the One Ring. In response, Zeb activates Walking Ballista again, removing a counter, pinging Alana for 1, killing her, and Zeb wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what an awesome set of games tonight. We love seeing all the new commanders from Wilds of Eldraine. We had a blast brewing, breaking, and playing with these new cards. What cards are you most excited about from the new set? What would you like to see next? Let us know in the comments below. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Thanks again to Wizards of the Coast for sponsoring today's video. Be sure to check out the link in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.